Good afternoon, welcome. My name is Brian Jacob. I'm director of the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. As many of you know, this is part of a regular kind of seminar series that we do on different topics. Later next semester, we'll be having some talks on corrections policy in Michigan, on education and economic development. And actually next week, we're sponsoring a conference on the 5th anniversary of the Cherry Commission. The commission looked at higher education and economic development in Michigan, and there'll be a public panel for that next Thursday. I would urge you to all attend. I would like, before I kind of turn it over to my colleague Barry Rabe for the substantive introductions, I'd like to thank Barry and some others who helped put this together. First of all, I'd like to thank the Program on the Environment and Robert Owens for helping sponsor this event, and the Goldring Family Foundation, that I understand is also responsible in part for the funding here. And I'd like to thank some of the folks that helped coordinate the event, including Kimberly Smith, Bonnie Roberts, Joe Crane, and Beth Rybar. And then I guess with that, I will turn it over to Barry to talk about our panelists and give us the directions for the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. I would only echo those acknowledgments and say how delighted I am to see this collaborative opportunity between Close-Up and the Ford School and the Program and the Environment, and a particular welcome to Bob Owen, Paul Webb, and folks from the Program and the Environment for joining forces with the Ford School in this activity. It's really a great pleasure to have all of you here. In many respects, the theme for today relates to an enduring, yet perhaps an expanding topic that face modern governments. The issue of where to locate facilities that can convey a broad public benefit, but may concentrate concerns, losses, economic or otherwise, for those communities that ultimately will host a particular facility. And almost invariably, when we have conversations along these lines, we think of those facilities, prisons, waste disposal facilities, for which there's a long-standing degree of conflict and controversy. But as today's conversation suggests, that type of policy dilemma is one that really weaves into a number of arenas, and is in fact one that is increasingly interwoven with almost all matters concerning energy development, including, more consistent with the topic for today, renewable energy. Obviously, this becomes a growing consideration for a variety of reasons, one of them being public policy, whether it's the state of Rhode Island, where our lecturer lives, or the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where his research has been based, or the state of Michigan, or many others. There are now regulatory mandates in place that require a consistent and steady increase in the volume of electricity that will come from renewable sources. And certainly in the state of Michigan, as we contemplate an automotive future, a vehicular future, that could indeed be far more reliant on electricity than conventional transportation fuels, the whole issue of expanding that electricity source and where those sources will come from becomes an intriguingly complex policy question and an issue. And so we turn today to the issue of siting of renewable energy facilities, and indeed talk about a case, and in fact a book, that has really received considerable attention, and in some respects has framed or reframed the way we think about renewable energy, and more specifically wind turbines. When Bob Whitcomb, the Goldring lecturer for this year, and his co-author Wendy Williams began to explore this topic, and I don't want to steal too much of Bob's thunder, there's much for him to say. Cape Wind had really received relatively little visible attention, little notoriety. And once the book was published, it received a tremendous outpouring of attention, certainly in print media, a range of electronic media responses that put one or both of the authors before a range of prominent journalists, running the gamut from Jon Stewart in The Daily Show to Sean Hannity to all other sorts of settings.
It was violent.
As I said, I'll leave the details to our speaker. But we have now begun to reach the point where Cape Wind has become almost a metaphor of sorts. And today, as we talk about not just that case, but beyond Cape Wind, it opens up a series of issues and questions. And we're indeed fortunate, and we have been all day, to have Bob Whitcomb with us. You have in the handout his record, an extraordinary record in political journalism, financial journalism, with a number of institutions over a series of decades, including work and co-authorship on the book Cape Wind. Bob will be talking about the book, but also the aftermath and other lessons that begin to emerge from that ongoing case. And we're also very, very fortunate to be joined by two colleagues closer to home here in Michigan, who will be putting a bit more of a local or regional perspective on things. And I'm just delighted to welcome Matt Wagner from DTE. Matt holds degrees in environmental engineering from both Penn State and the University of Michigan. Previously worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the auto office here in Ann Arbor. Has worked in several capacities in environmental enforcement and the like for DTE, but now has the intriguing title of Manager of Wind Site Development. A really cool title, I thought, and we'll be bringing the perspective of some of these issues as they're beginning to play out in Michigan. We're also delighted to be joined by Sally Churchill, Vice President and Secretary of the University of Michigan, but best known to many students in the room, and certainly me, as a much respected instructor of a course in environmental law. In fact, for the 10 years that I've been teaching an environmental politics and policy course offered through the program in the environment, I must say, I don't think I've ever said this to you, Sally, the one course that students most frequently, some of them are here today, most frequently will comment upon in classes, well, in Professor Churchill's class we talked about, which I think is one of the highest compliments students can pay an instructor, Sally brings tremendous expertise in various areas of environmental law, including many that relate to concerns of land use. And so we'll begin with a presentation from Bob, open things up for conversation with Matt and Sally, and then we'll leave time for open conversation and a bit of a panel. But first, please join me in welcoming both of our discussants and the 2009 Goldring Family Distinguished Lecturer, Bob Whitcomb.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much, Barry, and it's great to be here in Michigan, where a sister lives here in Ann Arbor, by the way, and a brother near Saugatuck, where he tells me they'll never put big windmills. Michigan wind power developers, I'm just going to read a kind of overview of the way I see the issues raised by this, and then we'll get into more of a conversation later. Michigan wind power developers will have the benefit of learning from the torture inflicted on Cape Wind. Through Cape Wind, though Cape Wind's case is unique in many ways, it's the first such project, and one in a very unusual place, one of the richest resort areas in the world. This controversy has ground on since 2001, since around 9/11. And for those of you who have not been following the case, it's a proposal to put, let me see, okay, next one, 130 wind turbines, windmills in that blue area. That's federal jurisdiction. Most of the rest of the water is state jurisdiction. That's a major reason they wanted to put it there, so they avoid problems from the state. So that blue area, again, is where this huge wind farm would go. And this area here is one of the richest resort areas in the world. It includes towns called Cotuit, Osterville, Hyannis Port, where the Kennedys are from. So you can see it's quite close, this area here, quite close to the wind farm. Everything moving right along area. And then you can see Nantucket down there, and then the vineyard. From the south coast of Cape Cod there, you would be on one of the relatively rare clear days in the region. The region is usually very hazy in much of the year, especially in the summer, by the way. During the resort season, it's very hazy because the prevailing wind's southwest. So it picks up stuff in the air, and it's hard to see more than about 2 miles. But on a very clear day, you could see, not forever, but you could see on the horizon from those islands there, that, by the way, is owned by a lot of Berkshire Hathaway people. You can see the edge of the wind farm, and from there too. This area this whole region here has a great deal of money, some of it New England money, but a lot of it Midwest money, money from Pittsburgh, Mellon money, Chicago money, Armour, Swift, you know the names, it's sort of Lake Forest, Sur-la-Mer. So there's lots of money there. Anyway, this thing has ground on for one hell of a long time, and I see we're in the Betty Ford classroom, and I'm very happy to be associated with the Fords because I think they're terrific people. Jerry Ford, I think, was the best kind of thoughtful conservative that we have lost track of to some extent. And it would be surprising if the Cape Wind melodrama hadn't sent a few folks out to the Betty Ford Center, though, in Palm Springs for rehab. If they went out there, they'd actually see some windmills there, which they will not see anywhere near Cape Wind. Anyway, of course, the strongest analogy between the Massachusetts and Michigan situations is that they both have considerable offshore wind resources, where I would think the northwest lower peninsula, probably particularly favorable parts of the UP. But ominously, there are some summer resort towns up there, too. I don't think anyone's going to put 150 wind turbines in front of Harbor Springs. Maybe I'm wrong. But be ready for anything. The latest wrinkle in the Cape Wind case, as some of you may have heard, is that a local Indian tribe, and just about aided and abetted by the primary wind farm foes, just about all of them are white, are trying to stop Cape Wind on the basis of the idea that all of Nantucket Sound was an Indian burial area when it was dry land during the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago. And therefore, putting wind turbines there would insult the tribe's spiritual traditions. The financial arrangements between the tribe, the Wampanoag tribe, and the prime opponents of the wind farm are unknown in detail, but are being pursued by far better reporters than me. And so it goes on and on and on. When blocking energy projects, there seem to be no limits to the human imagination, whatever the site. Putting up energy facilities is particularly difficult in the United States, where an excessively layered local, state, and federal regulatory system, lots of very local home rule, and the love of litigation make getting any big project done very difficult. And when new technology comes along, such as with wind farms, solar, geothermal, whatever, it gets even tougher. Whole new permitting processes must be invented. And I should say this is a sort of myth that we're not the land of bureaucracy and paperwork. This is baloney. This country is the center of bureaucracy and paperwork, duplication, and so on, compared to, say, the Western European social democracies, which many Americans like to say are very bureaucratic. I've worked there a long time. This is anybody who's done a federal income tax form will testify. And this has certainly gotten heavily into the renewable energy business. Perhaps only the Iranians closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which passes about a quarter of the world's oil, will finally get our attention in these matters. A tricky thing, however, about renewable energy plants is that compared to fossil fuel plants, which you can put pretty much anywhere you want, siting of green energy sites can be quite limited within a jurisdiction. If you want a solar plant, you have to make sure the site has an adequate kind of exposure and isn't too cloudy. If you want a wind plant, you have to make sure that it has adequate average wind. And by the way, Cape Wind has very, very good wind. That's why another major reason they want to put the wind farm there. But that can mean scenic ridge lines which the locals don't want to face with reminders that the electricity doesn't just come out of a switch in the wall, or in the middle of a yachting area like Nantucket Sound. And you can fairly easily put fossil fuel plants next to an already existing transmission line. You'd have to lay new lines to get to many green energy plants sites, which are off in the middle of nowhere. So just a complexity to think about. Further, the intermittent nature of wind and solar power raises grid connection issues that can further complicate site selection. The alternative energy site chooses the project, not the other way around. Fossil fuel is much more flexible. I mean, fossil fuel is pretty convenient. We should be honest about that. Then there's the paradox, or whatever it is, that many of the same densely populated areas that most lack conventional energy resources, such as New England, and would benefit economically and environmentally the most from having green energy, are the most vehement against them, because the population there is not used to seeing energy facilities of any kind near them. The substitution of banana I love this acronym, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, for mere NIMBYism is well underway, and I certainly wouldn't want to be in the utility business. It will be until oil reaches perhaps $200 a barrel. One major lesson of the Cape Wind case is that you better know the demographics of any area where you want to build an energy project. Don't make any public announcements until you thoroughly know the local population and have quietly consulted with all major groups. Local luminaries can be especially oppositional if they feel they're being blindsided, and they'll probably be very oppositional anyway. This is what these things look like. And by demographics, I'm not mostly talking about average income, racial composition, and so on. I'm talking about knowing who in the area has political and economic power, and what sort of organizations, which are often technically nonprofit and for the public good, they use to promote their interest. And of course, very important is what sort of personal, political, and financial relationships they might have with powerful local, state, and federal officials. When the crowd trying to start Cape Wind somewhat ingenuously began, the principals did not seem at first to realize that while their project might ultimately be alluring to the mass of the region's population, which it turned out to be, they've got about 75–80% support in the most polling in the region, that was necessary to co-opt or figure out how to defeat the region's most powerful group. In the Cape Wind case, that meant a small group of rich people concentrated in a summer resort village called Osterville. It was really that narrow, to my astonishment. When I was researching this thing, a big surprise to me was how simple it all turned out to be. I said, this opposition has got to be a lot more complicated. Anyway, and these people in the south shore of Cape Cod were even more concentrated in 2 private clubs. And then the level of concentration went down to 2 or 3 very rich people, one of whom was the ringleader, who was in charge of running an oil, gas, and coal company, some of you may have heard of, called Koch Industries. This is William Koch, kind of a socialite, winner of the America's Cup, a person with a dramatic private life, shall we say, and famous for having sued his mother and his brothers. I'm sort of sympathetic to that, but I won't go into my family history at this point. They had many friends in Washington and on Wall Street. One of their friends was called Edward M. Kennedy. Okay, I'll skip over my quick cracks about special interests in Washington. Anyway, much of the thwarting of energy projects is done by using, as I said, these nonprofit organizations that are really fronts for groups with very narrow but well-funded interest, which adds another layer of difficulty in such controversies. Energy developers would do well to study carefully the 501c3 filings of groups opposed to their proposed projects to see who is financing whom. So don't go by the name of the organization. If something says Friends of Wildlife, maybe, maybe not. There's the wonderful outfit based in Chicago called the Heartland Institute, which does all sorts of exciting stuff, and which is kind of an example. It also does some good stuff. Anyway, a group identifying itself as an environmental organization might be just a group formed to keep the general public as far away as possible from the estates of rich people, or to protect a yacht club, or maybe even the business of a nearby coal plant. But this takes a lot of work. You often have to go into freedom of information filings to find out who is running what and who is funding what. Meanwhile, misinformation is more widely and more rapidly spread than ever because of the internet, and the corrections can rarely entirely catch up. Consider the rumors about the swine flu vaccine. There are many rumors about the dangers of swine flu, so a lot of parents are not having their kids vaccinated. Cape Wind's foes became expert in misinformation, some of it via the miracle of Photoshop. And I think we've got this on here. Some of these, no, that's not, that's not very clear. Yeah, that's the example. That's probably been hyped up a bit. You see the windmills in the distance? You can do a lot. There you go. That's, it's a miracle. So, see how big they look. They really wouldn't look like that. They'd be slightly visible, but much, much lower. So wind farm and other green energy developers better have a website that immediately responds to local issues as they come up. The failure of Cape Wind's CEO, Jim Gordon, and his colleagues to find ways to bring in support of powerful people early on and to consolidate support among natural allies and quickly get the public to understand the benefits of the project has caused disastrous delays in getting the project approved and greatly slowed the progress of other alternative energy projects in the United States, in my view. Mr. Gordon et al. Grossly underestimated the sense of entitlement of Cape Wind's foes and their ability and their willingness to fund opposition. He did not initially do adequate socioeconomic homework because he believed that his project's environmental and economic allures were so obvious, especially since he announced his proposal around the time of 9/11, appeals to patriotism and all that. And I should emphasize again, he also figured he'd make one hell of a lot of money from this thing. This is a businessman. Gordon underestimated his foes' immense resources and their willingness to use it to buy influence in the political and regulatory process at the state and federal levels. So while most of his foes were summer people, they had a sense of ownership of the region, even though they weren't there most of the year, wet and dry, that often seemed to exceed that of the year-rounders. And so it will be elsewhere. These are people, again, people names like Kennedy, Mellon, and other people. Lots of money who are there perhaps 4 weeks, 6 weeks of the year. The year-rounders, for their parts, mostly wanted cheaper and more reliable electricity rates and better paying jobs than, for instance, those at summer resorts, minimum wage jobs. Once Gordon got it across that Cape Wind might bring them that, the PR skies brightened for him. Gordon and his Cape Wind allies also at first didn't know that some of its opponents' wealth came from oil, gas, and coal resources that might lose their charm with the arrival of major alternative energy operations. That's not to say, of course, that some non-rich people didn't oppose the wind farm too. Plenty did, especially at first. But they were quite insignificant in the success so far of efforts to stop Cape Wind. Exacerbating everything is the whole U.S. permitting system is a mess. It needs major streamlining. And for a brand new project like Cape Wind, it's just brutally difficult. But my view is whatever you think of Cape Wind, and there are certainly perfectly plausible reasons to oppose it, which I can talk about later if you like. Sailing is important to many people, and there may be some interconnection issues. But whatever you think of Cape Wind, and the book itself, I should emphasize, did not state that Cape Wind should be built. It's really about process. But if the U.S. is to have a well-functioning electricity system in this century, we need to stop fossil fuel to some extent, as much as it can. We've got to find a way of speeding up the approval or rejection of such projects. In this case, again, it's really from inception to now, it's been 9 years, $30 million. Cape Wind's key foes didn't want to look at the turbines from their summer houses, and they most certainly didn't want to look at them when they were sailing in their yachts in Nantucket Sound. And I'm sure there's some watery regions in Michigan, I think of the Harbor Springs area, as I said, where you could get the same kind of opposition. In the end, interestingly, the battle is mostly over visual aesthetics, at least this battle. There are noise issues in some of the land-based ones, but this is really about visual aesthetics. And wind power proponents better have a strong comeback, such as citing the aesthetics of clean air and water, when people sincerely complain that they just don't want to look at proposed wind turbines, which they think will ruin their surroundings. But many of the best financed foes won't honestly say they just don't want to look at these things. They'll try to bring in other matters, such as saving birds and bats or alleging a menace to nearby aviation or radar installations. That's not to say, of course, that in some areas wind turbines or other alternate energy facilities might pose such threats to wildlife or birds or bats or aviation and radar. And Matt and Barry and I were talking about Altamont, terrible wind farm in California, built in the late 70s, killed a lot of birds. There are bad places for these things. But if a really serious wind power developer better be prepared to call on the Audubon Society to do studies that would clear a project of allegations that it would threaten a lot of birds, and/or developers putting very expensive, large buffer areas around green energy facilities, and developers might have to downsize their projects, making them economically less attractive. Cape Wind was certainly far too sluggish for its own good in responding to charges drummed up by the environmentalist sounding organization, the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound, that the windmills would be a threat to wildlife, especially to birds, and mysteriously and non-existently to seals and whales and fish. Those poor seals with their big golden retriever eyes. In fact, the water is about that deep. Whales don't go there. No whales there. It's not. In fact, of course, the precise siting of wind farms is all important in determining whether such a facility might imperil birds or anything else, or the duck-billed platypus, for that matter. Cape Wind site in the middle of Nantucket Sound, like the wind farm areas offshore Europe, was not a place where big windmills would endanger a lot of birds. I just wanted to take it back to the red area there is the best wind resource, highest average wind, by the way. You can see Cape Wind is not in it, but it's sort of close to it. Cape Wind would be about there. Okay. In fact, of course, okay, in the middle, okay. In Europe, here we go, yeah. In the middle of Nantucket, it's not a bad area it's not going to endanger seriously any wildlife. It's somewhat like, the best analogy is the wind farm areas offshore Europe, especially Denmark, with probably the most famous ones. They have not had they've had very, very few bird kills there. But part of the PR problem is the public did not understand that there are wide variations in effect on wildlife depending on the exact location of the site. Site is all, it's not technology. And that, for instance, raptor kills around wind turbines in the California mountains, as we talked, may have no significance for offshore wind turbines. So there's a big lesson to all developers. I know poor Matt's dealing with this, is know your local zoology. Know it well. In order to make a strong enough case at the start that fossil fuel power plants pose far more danger to birds and other wildlife than windmills overall, through air and water pollution and oil spills. Indeed, a well-timed oil spill in a place called Buzzards Bay near the proposed windmill site helped Cape Wind make its case about 2 years into the controversy. By the way, make another kind of a NIMBY joke. The group that's charged itself with protecting Buzzards Bay, which is called, I think, the Coalition for Buzzards Bay, was all in favor of the windmills in Nantucket Sound. However, it is opposed to the big windmill project proposed for Buzzards Bay. So this is, but they'd get the electricity from it. It's the same grid, so it's just wonderful. People are great. But while many birds might die because of effects of oil or gas, coal or oil plant, they tend to die in a dispersed and undramatic way. While a few birds crashing into a windmill, though they generally fly around them, as they do around buildings, can get a lot of attention. This requires some subtlety and explanation to the public, which doesn't thrive on nuance. Cape Wind expended needless energy citing the perils of global warming as a good reason to approve this facility. But the dirty secret is that few Americans give a damn about global warming, which is mostly an issue among the elite, like the people at the University of Michigan, some of my pals. Warning of the menace of, say, the melting of the polar ice caps and the inundation of Miami Beach in 75 years just doesn't get traction with economically anxious Americans. After all, as Keynes liked to say, in the long run, we're all dead. Americans do care about toxic air pollution. They worry about the poisons emitted by oil and coal plants, sulfur dioxide, lead, mercury, and so on, and they want more reliable and, bigger electricity infrastructure, which they hope will keep down their electricity prices and make blackouts and brownouts less likely. And they don't like that we buy so much fuel from corrupt dictatorships abroad. Cape Wind, for its part, was a bit slow to emphasize how fragile the region's electricity supplies were to promote its project as a way to avoid brownouts and blackouts, which again, a lot of people worry about. Whatever the site, electricity reliability is a strong selling point. Cape Wind got a huge boost, by the way, when the entire New England grid almost went down on a frigid January in 2004. Very close call. Came with about an hour of the whole thing going down. In the middle of the winter, it was, I think, 25 below at the time in New Hampshire. So it could have been a fairly exciting time. Let me see, okay. But perhaps most of all, local people worry about the demise of high-paying jobs and desperately seek ones that will replace those lost with the decline of such industries as automobiles. Thus, Michigan would seem perfectly suited to make the green energy jobs pitch in depressed areas, especially around cities such as Flint and the wide open but not entirely prosperous sections of the Upper Peninsula. The jobs pitch, and that there are comparatively few rich and politically well-connected people in those areas to block proposed projects, should make them very attractive as green energy sites. Alternate energy developers might also want to site green power plants and new economic development centers to go at places like old automobile plants, where locally produced green energy equipment such as solar panels and wind turbine blades could also be made, along with other products, maybe even auto parts. Such siting could help energy developers get financing. Think of making turbine blades and then using them at wind farms at the same property. That some residential property owners complain about windmill noise at night is another good reason to put them in commercial or industrial zoned areas, such as how about a Walmart parking lot? And obviously farmers with loads of land that can act as a buffer against complaining neighbors and the revenue that farmers get from utilities and developers that helps offset the wildly fluctuating prices for crops will continue to be major targets for developers seeking wind and increasingly solar energy sites. Farmers are probably the most enthusiastic providers of wind turbine land now. In fact, they protest if they don't get them because of the income. Meanwhile, there may be a partial but increasingly important solution to the issues raised by the huge tracts or the large tracts of land needed for wind power and other alternate energy sites, and to deal with visual impacts and other issues. That's geothermal, which generally requires a smaller footprint than wind and solar, and at the same time, concerns about the release of toxic gases from geothermal facilities are being addressed. Geothermal, not wind or solar, could end up being the easiest alternative energy facilities to site, assuming that engineering improvements in our knowledge of geology proceed as fast as they have the last few years. Cape Wind was a bit slow in getting across the idea that could be the source of such high-paying jobs, certainly far better paying than those at summer resorts and marinas. I know that Michigan officials are pushing those jobs as a small but promising offset to the auto industry's decline. The jobs pitch has to be made early and often. Michigan, with its vast number of people familiar with machine making and metal and plastic materials, would probably be a better place to create wind power related jobs than, say, Massachusetts, where unemployed mutual fund employees probably are probably not up to the task. Cape Wind took some time to learn that attacks must be responded to fast, and its strongest basic themes, especially more reliable and cleaner electricity and jobs, could never be repeated enough to an increasingly deficit disordered public. A developer needs to have a relentless, almost ruthless presidential campaign approach to drum up these benefits and undermine foes. The first thing I'd do as a green energy developer is hire a political operative with a strong PR background, a skin as thick as an elephant, and then a good regulation lawyer or two, and one who's comfortable in the State House and in Washington. Cape Wind and other alternative energy companies also have to deal head-on with the complaint that their energy would be too expensive and subsidized by the taxpayers, as are virtually all energy projects one way or the other. They must remind people that whatever the ups and downs of fossil fuel prices in recent years, that they are far more likely to go up than down, making wind power, solar, and other non-fossil fuel energy prices more attractive than they might seem at the start. 5 minutes, oh my God, I'll take out pages 14 through 115. Okay. And since Cape Wind was a first-timer in so many ways, Cape Wind and regulatory officials at the state and federal level had to invent new approaches for permits for such novel alternative projects. Even without the astonishingly well-funded opposition, this is bound to be difficult. After all, it wasn't even clear which agencies would be in charge. Since Cape Wind was announced, federal and state regulatory processes have become clearer, but more clarity, streamlining, and speed are needed. It's hard to see how there would be a big increase in the percentage of alternative energy in the nation's energy mix without making it much easier for state officials to approve a developer with a site and then push for expeditious handling of permit applications. The aim should be to get construction started within, say, 2 years of initial public proposals. If a site looks like it can't be used until much further in the future than that, then most developers and their financial backers will run away. Few financial backers would be willing to wait so long with such uncertain prospects. The jurisdictional issues posed by the fact that Cape Wind would plunk its windmills in a small leased area, again, just for let me see here, a small leased area of federal waters surrounded by Massachusetts waters has made this a regulatory lawyer's bonanza. And you could see similar disputes going on in the Great Lakes, where you've got one provincial government, a bunch of states, and the federal government. It'll be pretty exciting, especially if they do a kind of a bi-national wind farm in Lake Huron. That would be a thrill. So Michigan and other states need to give clear guidelines on height, buffer zones, noise levels, and other characteristics of wind turbines or other renewable energy facilities. To let every township set its own policies and have veto power could pretty much kill wide-scale wind power in the Wolverine state. I think this also means the federal jurisdiction will have to be expanded. So this is a lot of local authority may be diminished. Michigan officials from the governor on down seem genuinely passionate about making green energy the state's next best thing. The one way to do it is to standardize as much as possible the permitting process, which means, again, fights over superseding local zoning, big battles. There are, by current estimates, about 25,000 local zoning jurisdictions in the U.S. So that gives you some idea of the problem ahead, citing these things. So perhaps this means that very small wind turbine projects that provide so-called distributed power, a windmill to light up a house or an office building, will become very attractive, increasingly attractive, as developers are scared off by the challenges faced by the big projects. But even that will probably require substantial increases in state jurisdiction. I keep thinking of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which opened up the cell phone revolution, which made it a lot easier to cite cell phones. I think there was tremendous erosion of local control in that. I know he's doing their time. Obviously, hilly regions would be particularly alluring, especially in lower income areas that want the jobs and won't fight the site, won't fight the siting and cheaper electricity. The western Michigan on the coast of the lake is extremely attractive for this if developers can fend off considerable opposition, especially from summer people. There are a lot of summer people there. Areas that want solar. And those making siting decisions will also have to bear in mind the necessity of promoting battery storage and other improved means of achieving stable pricing. The prospect of wild swings in supplies and prices caused by the erratic nature of wind and solar generation could scare away a lot of potential supporters, whatever the siting. And of course, the transmission issues are very, very serious. The United States basically needs new transmission system to take in the electricity from new power generating plants. And this is going to be a very serious problem. There are also legislative things coming down the pike that could further complicate matters. Midwestern states may have to duke it out with East Coast wind power developers over proposed federal regulations the East Coast developers see as unduly favoring Midwest developers. The feds might give preferential treatment to wind power people in regions with high power plant carbon emissions, such as parts of the Midwest, which burns a lot of coal and yet has less wind power potential than the offshore East Coast. There are moves afoot in Congress to encourage the export of electricity from the Great Plains and the Great Lakes to load centers in the East Coast, disfavoring East Coast outfits. This means more of an incentive to build big wind farms in this part of the country with the siting implications that entails. There could be a Donnybrook about this. Anyway, cruising down to the end here by the windmills. Hopefully officials in Michigan and other states are hard at work putting together an inventory of good sites at wind farms and other alternative energy sites and will promote them in a way to help create a coherent statewide alternative energy system that works well for the grid and economic development. This will involve such issues as ease of connection to the grid, transportation infrastructure, local population density, and wildlife challenges. As state officials work on this, they'll see how much local zoning and other regulations must be changed, eliminated in many cases, and how much statewide standardization is necessary. The state should also establish a certified sites program that creates a consistent state-approved standard for energy facility location and eases the permitting process. And this will probably also require considerable coordination with the feds. The orderliness and predictability in power plant construction this would create would help lure developers scared off by the sort of delays seen in the Cape Wind melodrama. I'll close with the immortal words of Bill Koch, the oil and coal mogul from Kansas, who has led the fight against Cape Wind, which you'd have to look at on the horizon from his mansion. It's a very nice mansion, too. He said, quote, "I was telling one of my guys when the Cape Wind proposal first came up, I wish I'd thought of this. But as a businessman, I said, I wouldn't have put it in my backyard, I would have put it in somebody else's backyard." So, thank you. Is the time okay? Except for the eliminations of pages 14 through 18. It was great fun.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank
That was
you.
great. Well, just so you know, the state of Michigan is working on the inventory of optimal sites, both on land and offshore. They're a little further ahead on the on land aspect. The Wind Energy Zone Board report has come out, and there are 4 different regions. I'm not going to get into those today. I want to talk a little bit more towards Bob's remarks and his book in particular. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a good read. I guess what struck me more about that book than anything else was the audacity of the individuals that took on the Cape Wind project without having any information. And it was just that, we were talking about it before, it's really that sense of entitlement. The arrogance that they could just feel like, this is our sound, and how dare you come near it with any kind of ideas. But yeah, 9 years, right? Still counting. I wanted to start with a couple of NIMBY-like acronyms, and Bob stole my thunder on banana. I also had that one on my list. Another one, if you're following carbon sequestration, which is the storage of carbon, CO2 underground, one of them I've heard that I like is NUMBY, not under my backyard. And then one I heard just recently, which I really love, is a gentleman was talking about resistance to renewable siting, and he referred to CAVE people. And CAVE stands for Citizens Against Virtually Everything. So those things are fun to talk about and fun to laugh about. What I'm experiencing, particularly in the thumb of Michigan, is, there is pushback in some circles, and it's not all hooey. It's not all people who just have a reticence to looking at the turbines, although viewshed is a big deal. But I guess I'd like to just start with some of the similarities between my experience up in the thumb and DTE's experience and what Bob talked about in the book. Like Gordon, when we walked into the thumb, we thought with some good dialogue, and we're going to talk to them about clean energy, and they're just going to say, sounds great, let's do it. We did surveys up in the thumb, and there's greater than 60% people who really believe in wind energy and they want to do it. But there's also a very small but extremely vocal minority that's against it. And it's challenged us to listen and really evaluate what they're saying and what has merit and what doesn't. Another thing that seems hands down is that the community stand to gain financially and economically in very significant ways. But like in Cape Wind, they downplay those things. We had one township where during a hearing regarding a draft ordinance, they basically said, no one here can talk about any of the economics of the project or the opportunities for wind. We're not going to talk about those things. Now, some authorities in higher courts had some concerns with that, but that was one of the ways to kind of, in their minds, to kind of focus people in a little different way. Bob mentioned sort of the dichotomous community in the Nantucket Sound area. We've got that too. One of the townships that we're working with is right on the lake, and they've got folks who come up, folks who have owned land there for years and years and years, and people who moved up there from the cities because they want the peace and quiet and they want the pristine view. And frankly, there's not just a debate between the developers and the local residents. There is also a significant debate within those communities. There's farmers who stand to gain and want to help with some folks are doing this for idealistic reasons. They are going to make a little bit of money, but they believe in the new cleaner technologies. And so we're seeing that too. There's been some pretty interesting debates. I use the word interesting carefully. Really the real issue, and I think Ted Kennedy eventually confessed, it is, I just don't like the look of them. We think that's probably one of the driving factors in the thumb as well. Although, talking about the view just doesn't stand up to people. It's not as convincing as things like wildlife and sound and the economics, or well, this really isn't going to make anybody any money. And so that's been interesting. There are actually some states who have said, you can challenge a wind farm, but if you come to me and challenge it because you don't like the way it looks, we're going to throw it out. And so there's a lot of courts in the states now that are saying, we're not going to listen to issues about viewshed. We'll take your challenges for wildlife and other things, but viewshed is not something that we're going to honor. One of the things that I really liked, one of the gentlemen who led the charge for the Alliance against Cape Wind made a statement, and he said, we're not against renewable energy, but we're not for it in this location, which I loved. And I captured a quote during a meeting I was in up in one of the townships in the Thumb, and here's the quote from the Planning Commission chairman. We're not against clean energy. We just don't think it's a good idea here. So, that's a very common statement. And, I think that's a way of people wanting to have their cake and eat it too. But, the devil is in the details. A couple more things that were similarities. Walter Cronkite, before he sort of came around and realized what was really going on, said he thought wind turbines would be better in the mountains of New England. Some of the folks that we've been debating regarding on-land turbines said, well, we think they would be better offshore. And so there's that irony too. The people onshore think it'd be better offshore and vice versa. We had a meteorological tower that we proposed in one township, and we were asking for a 22-foot variance on it. They denied it, and they said it was a procedural denial. It was on grounds of procedure. And as we talked to them and discussed the denial, it was very clear that they felt like if they approved the Met Tower, the meteorological tower, they were opening the door to subsequent approvals for turbines themselves. And, in the same way in Cape Wind, they were planning to put up a tower, and the Alliance saw that as sort of a preemptive strike. So a couple more similarities.
The wind tower is up, I should say.
What's that?
The wind tower is up in
Right.
Nantucket Sound.
That's-
Great weather reports there. You can look it up on the internet. It's very exciting, especially in a hurricane or a blizzard.
Offshore data is better. There's much better wind, and wind is key. I mean, you're right, Bob, that what drives a renewables project, particularly a wind project, is where. You don't decide where, the where decides for you. And your first decision is, does it have good wind? Because if it doesn't have good wind, the economics are not going to work, and you're not going to have a project. Couple more things. One, somebody tried to do an end run. I don't remember the names in DC, but somebody tried to do an end run on the Energy Policy Act amendment saying, no turbines within 1.5 miles of navigational channels, and when you draw all those buffers, there's no room left for wind turbines. We had a similar an ordinance, a draft ordinance that provided wildlife buffers that were very extreme. I mean, we've been doing a lot of wildlife studies in the thumb because environmental stewardship for DTE is a big deal. And when we drew all those buffers from that ordinance in that township, there was no room left for wind. And, frankly, from a personal standpoint, I would have rather just said, hey, we're just not gonna have any wind turbines here. But instead, sometimes folks will draft things in a way to exclude them without really saying, we wanna exclude them. The one big difference between, there were a lot of similarities between what we've been experiencing and what you guys, or not you, but what the folks have experienced out there. The big difference to me is for Cape Wind folks, the only time they're really truly in their way is when they're out sailing. Sure, you can see them. I think Gordon said they were about the half the size of a thumb is what you'd really see out there. But they're really only going to be affected by them when they're out trolling or fishing or doing whatever they do in the Sound. Drinking. Sounds good to me. In the thumb, the truth is that these things are a lot closer to being in a resident's backyard or being in a farmer's field than what you've got in Cape Wind. And so, there's sort of the rub or the big challenge, I think, for siting on land. And particularly in Michigan and particularly in the thumb, it's not like in Texas where you've got literally many square miles where you can put turbines and you're not gonna have a big effect on, somebody's residence. There's actually a fairly high residential density in the thumb. And, when we brought our consultants up, when I started doing wind, there's still a lot to learn, but our consultants came in and said, man, you got a lot of homes around here. And it will be a challenge, and it is a challenge, frankly, because you do have to take into account the fact that there are homes in a higher density than in other places, like, for example, the Texas Panhandle, where it's relatively straightforward I shouldn't say straightforward. It's challenging to site a wind project anywhere you go. But, in terms of community relations and interactions with homeowners and others, there's a little bit, it's a little easier to do in some other locations. And so that high residential density, makes it a little more tough for doing wind in Michigan, frankly, and where we spend most of our time, which is in the thumb. And what I've heard from others in terms of, and been experiencing firsthand in terms of what is really affecting folks who are concerned about having a wind turbine near their home, whether it's 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, it's fairly subjective, is, it's an issue of quality of life. Obviously people who are opposed to siting wind turbines believe, they feel like they're right about that. There's issues of view, there's issues of heritage, and they've been on this land forever. There's some concerns about their health, income, noise, sense of control, and for some people, landscape is a spiritual issue. And when you're messing with that, it's like the Indians now that are challenging this. And there's a quote, if I don't run out of time, I'd like to read it, that I caught on an editorial recently. And the problem with that is those are opinions. And I can, if we're talking about scientific data, maybe I can say, well, your opinion's wrong because your data's wrong. But somebody who thinks a turbine is ugly, I can't say, no, you're wrong. That's their opinion, and it's hard to combat that. Somebody who says, well, those turbines are noisy, noise is also very subjective. We can do things. We can analyze the line of sight. We can complete what we call shadow flicker analyses to figure out whether those effects when and where and how those effects will impact an individual. But if they're already negative to turbines, that's not going to mean a whole lot because, those issues of how a turbine looks. I know people who think they're beautiful, and I've also heard people describe them as industrial blight. As far as the noise issues, we can model turbine noise, and frankly, we're doing that because we want to try to site these things well. And then based on those models, we can set a turbine at X distance from a home to hopefully minimize those concerns regarding sound. But it's subjective too. Noise is a very subjective issue. And different people have different sensitivities. I read a woman's quote in the paper who said she felt like the whoosh of the blades was waves lapping on the shore, which is amazing. I would have never thought that on my own. But there's other people who think it sounds like a jet taking off. Sounds like there's some people who live near the turbines up in Ubley and Elkton who would say it's like I live near a runway. It's like I have a Detroit Metro in my backyard. And so those are challenges that aren't easily solved. And some of the time that's just sticking with it and persevering and listening and trying to come up with something that gets you down the road. In all this, DTE's approach we've tried to follow basically 3 guiding principles. The first one is do the right thing, and I know that sounds like Spike Lee, but it's really what we've tried to do. We've got core values. We've tried to conduct ourselves respectfully and in an open and honest fashion. Sometimes that gets us in trouble, and that route sometimes takes longer because sometimes people take that and they use that against you. But I think like the Cape Wind folks who slowly warmed up to Gordon and his team, they saw the underhanded tactics of the alliance, and eventually he had more people on his side than I think he ever imagined. And not in the exact same way, but we have decided in meetings where things get heated, we are going to be consistent, and we're going to be respectful, and we're going to try to give people the information that we have and know. And some people who have been on the fence have seen that, and they said, DTEs, these aren't the guys who are hollering and screaming, it's the guys on the other side of the table that are hollering at them and sometimes resorting to, things that are a little bit out of whack. So, but a lot of that takes time. And I guess one of the reasons why that's important to us is we are not a developer. And we know a lot of the developers up in the Thumb. We have great respect for everybody who's working up there. And it's an interesting, there's some competition there, but there's also some camaraderie there. But when those guys are gone, when they've set up their wind turbines and maybe DTE buys the project or however that works, we're still going to be around and in the communities, and we have to continue to work with these folks. So we have to do it in a way that creates a lasting impression. We also want to use sound science. We've told the folks we've been working with we want to let the data lead. We've done a lot of work on wildlife. We're doing a lot of work regarding noise. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of studies regarding the wind resource. Because in an industry that's sometimes ruled by subjectivity, science really sometimes is the only thing that keeps things objective. It's not always the end all because of opinions and things like that, but science is something we can cling to have some objectivity as we try to cite these projects. And the last thing that we openly admit is we're still learning. The wind industry, it seems like it's been around for a relatively long time, but the truth is it's still a new industry. And we're still learning a lot about technology and about proper siting techniques. What they'll tell you about a wind project is a lot of people will say 90% of the effort is in the siting. And that's because how you site these things has a big impact on your community relations, on how economically viable your project is, and a whole host of other things that roll out of that. And so what we're learning is that wind turbine siting is as much an art as a science. And really what I believe is, I think as we go forward, our real challenge will be to honor the concerns about the quality of life in our local communities without impeding the technological progress and interests of the communities statewide and nationally regarding our energy needs. And that's going to require patience, perseverance, innovation, lots of listening, lots of cups of coffee, as an offshore guy has been saying lately that I've talked to, and lots of hard work. And that's, based on reading your book and listening to your comments, those are the types of things that came to my mind. So, thank you.
So I have 2 hours, right? To talk about the law. But I talk fast, so I can pack in 2 hours in about 10 minutes because I want to save time for our panel. I used to be a lawyer for the state of Michigan. I was a lawyer for a small plaintiffs firm in Traverse City, Jim Olson, who has a practice kind of tilting at windmills, no pun intended. I've worked for a big fancy law firm in Detroit. And I was thinking as I was preparing for this, to think about the legal issues, if I worked for any of those entities, if I worked for the state, I worked for a plaintiff's firm in Traverse City, or if I worked for a big law firm in Detroit who represented DTE Energy, these are the legal issues that I would worry about, trying to cite a wind farm. I was thinking more about the Great Lakes offshore development, but a lot of this would also apply to onshore, land development like in the Thumb. So the first thing I would worry about as a lawyer for any of those clients is the public trust doctrine, which is this totally cool concept in law that the state holds certain resources for the benefit of the public and for, basically the seventh generation, and holds those resources in trust for the public. And when the state, when Michigan entered the Union, when we took over the bottomlands of Lake Michigan and, our jurisdiction, that's when the state of Michigan assumed this trust responsibility for the bottomlands of the Great Lakes in our jurisdiction. So the state has an obligation, and what's cool about the public trust doctrine is the state has the obligation, but any one of you as a private citizen or as a company or anybody can sue the state to force them to protect the public trust in resources. And these are resources that we know sort of our gut instinct can't be owned by the public. The deer, the fish, the water, the bottomlands of the Great Lakes, the rivers that run free, and so on. So I would worry about, if I were trying to cite a wind farm off, somewhere in Lake Michigan, not near Harbor Springs probably. I would worry about the public trust doctrine and whether the citing in some way kind of impinges upon the public trust, and whether the state can in fact approve use of the bottomlands of Lake Michigan as an example, consistent with the public trust. And the public trust is this totally cool it's not the common law, it's not a statute, it's just there. And it kind of goes back really kind of to the Roman law. But it's been around a long time, but there hasn't been a lot of case law. But there is a case that I teach in my class called Mono Lake, and some of you may know that case. It's a case out of California, and it was a public trust case. And it was a California Supreme Court case, so it's not really binding in Michigan legally. But one of the things that came out of the case was the recognition of the public trust doctrine to protect ecological and recreational interests, in that case as applied to Mono Lake. So if I were a lawyer here either trying to defend a wind farm or oppose one, I would want to be really familiar with the public trust doctrine and try and argue on either side of that, depending on your position, that the public trust has to be protected. Michigan also has a statute called the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, or MEPA, one of the first statutes like this enacted in the world, actually. It was back when Michigan was a proud leader of in environmental law. I think it was enacted in 1970. And the notion of what MEPA says is that any person can become a private attorney general. So anybody in this room can be a private attorney general and bring a case in court to protect, to prevent pollution, impairment, or destruction of natural resources or the public trust therein. So not only does the public trust exist out there, but in addition, we have this state law in Michigan, MEPA, that actually recognizes the authority of anybody in this room to go into court and bring a lawsuit to protect the public trust in the resources. So that's something that as a lawyer I would always sort of worry about or think about if I were trying to cite a wind farm, is whether somebody would bring a MEPA case to try and prevent it. Obviously there's an issue, well, not obviously, but to me, obviously, there's an issue of public nuisance. Is seeing, hearing, even seeing the turbines, does that create a public nuisance? I mean, that would be one of the first things I would think about as a lawyer. And there's arguments on both sides, but, and by that I mean, does it impose an unreasonable burden on the public? And again, there's an issue there. We think a nuisance is, pollution, dirty air, dirty water, and so on, but there's also an argument that it should apply to aesthetics, right? So should we have smog in the Grand Canyon? So I would argue that, if I wanted to oppose a wind farm, which I wouldn't personally, but it creates a public nuisance by having to look out and see these things. And it's an aesthetic issue, as Matt said. Depending on the location, I would worry about the Endangered Species Act. Are there, and again, it's all about location, location, and location, which also affects real estate values, right? But I would worry about whether there's any migratory birds or, migratory hawks, and there are, I think of birds in particular. I'm not too worried about fish, frankly, or other species. I mean, I'm worried about them, but not because of a wind farm. I would want to be sure that there aren't, migrating hawks traveling, that this isn't right in their flight, path and so on. I would worry about the transmission lines, not just the wind, the turbines, but also all the transmission lines that have to be developed to move the energy to where the people are. I forgot to tell you the first thing I would do. The first thing I would do is find out, I would call my contacts, I would find out where each of the justices on the Michigan Supreme Court have their summer home. And then I'm serious, you guys think I'm kidding. I would overlay a map and see where each of the 7 justices have their lake homes, compare it to the wind maps, and avoid those places. And then you're home free. And that's what he should have done. That's where they did screw up. I looked at your map and I was struck at how many great places there were that, weren't in the view of all these multi-gajillionaires. If there's any federal money involved or any federal touching of the project, if there's federal research money or any federal hook, then you have to worry about the National Environmental Policy Act, which then leads to an environmental impact statement, and some of you are probably familiar with that, but then having to look at the impacts on the socioeconomic impacts, the ecological impacts, and so on. The other thing I would worry about in Michigan is a statute we have, which actually is also potentially empowering, the Great Lakes Submerged Lands Act, which requires, and I'm just going to read you part of what the statute says, but basically it recognizes that the bottomlands of the Great Lakes are held in trust by the state of Michigan for the use and enjoyment of its citizens, and that the state as owner and trustee has a perpetual responsibility to the public to manage those bottomlands and waters to prevent pollution and for the protection of natural resources and so on. Now the state can, under this statute, issue permits to use bottomlands. They can lease bottomlands and so on, and they have done this for marinas, for deep, for docks, for ships and so on. So you would have to, I am sure, if you were in the Great Lakes and Michigan jurisdiction, have to get a permit from MDEQ, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, under the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act. So those are some of the things I would worry about. Do I think they're deal breakers? Probably not, honestly. I would worry a lot about local zoning. And if I were God and in charge of alternative energy in Michigan, I would work really hard to get a statute enacted in Michigan to try and preempt local regulation. I mean, if we're serious in Michigan about having alternative energy, we can't let local jurisdictions trump what is ultimately in the public interest of, the people in the state. And we have done that with other environmental laws. So, for example, our hazardous waste siting statute, or our statute that allows deep injection wells for liquid industrial waste. Both of those statutes have language that really preempts local regulation. And why? For the obvious reasons, because otherwise nobody wants those facilities in their backyard. Well, likewise, I think if the state is serious about alternative energy, and I know we say we are because we have a renewable energy portfolio, we'll see how serious we really are. We really need, I think, language in a state statute that doesn't allow local townships and local jurisdictions to, have an excessive amount, or maybe even any control over the siting. Maybe it all has to be regulated by the state. That would be my argument. couple other points I wanted to make. You know, you made some really good points, sort of tactical things you would want to do. I think the water quality is important. I mean, the mercury, you know, we can't eat fish, you know, I don't want to eat fish out of the Great Lakes because of mercury from power plants. Also the lower lake levels. I mean, I think that's a selling point. You know, people are concerned, they connect it to climate change, and so I think that's sort of something that, you know, could be done. Oh, another thing, going back to the legal issues that I would worry about is another argument that I'd want to think about is inverse condemnation. And that's the notion, like if somebody was opposed to it, so you'd want to be ready for it, is the idea that if the state did issue a permit under the Great Lakes Submerged Lands Act, then a homeowner could, you know, somebody who owns a, you know, $1 million, $2 million cottage near Harbor Springs or whatever, they might want to bring a lawsuit to say, well, gee, you know, my property used to be worth this, but now that I got to look out at these ugly turbines, you know, out in front of me in Lake Michigan, my property is worth less. And so you, state of Michigan, have diminished the value of my property, therefore you owe me compensation, you know, to this amount, or you should have you actually have to take my property. I mean, it's like a regulatory takings argument, but it's, basically, you know, you've diminished the value, so you have to buy it now. I mean, that would be the argument. I don't think it would, you know, fly, but you know, I guess it could. You talked about, I mean, just an observation, you know, the two places I'm familiar with in Michigan where I've seen turbines are in Mackinac City and in Traverse City, and in both places, it's total strip development, it's totally hideous, and so who cares, like, the turbines are the best looking thing, you know? I mean, seriously, you know? I mean, look outside of Traverse City, look outside of Mackinac City, you know? I mean, it could have been a, you know, national park, but instead, you know, look what we did to it. But, so, you know, maybe in a way being more urban is okay, you know, because it doesn't look good anyway, you know, some of these places. So anyway, those are some of the legal issues that I would worry about as a lawyer on any side of this issue, trying to promote it or trying to kill it. I think at the end of the day, honestly, I'm not that worried about these legal arguments, but doesn't mean you couldn't get it tied up in court for a long time. And so I would want to make sure you weren't citing it right outside the summer home of one of our justices. So I'll cut it off now so that we have time for our quick panel discussion, right? Questions or whatever? Yeah. Do you want me to? Yeah.
We'll now open up for conversation. We can also pass a list if you'd like to put your address of your summer residence down, so Matt can have that before he goes back to his office.
Thanks.
Sorry, Matt. Open it up for conversation. Questions, please.
If I could, three quick comments and maybe some reflections on them. One, you didn't mention the one acronym I'm familiar with is NOPE, not on planet Earth. The other thing is, a few years ago in this auditorium, there was a presentation on it called Visual Aesthetics, I think, and talking about view shed, and they had the comment of, it's not, in talking about the Cape Wind project, they said it's not the view, it's the vision. So, and then lastly, there's a publication entitled Taking the Red Tape Out of Green Power. I don't know if anybody's read of that or heard of it, but if you Google that, search it's called Taking Red Tape Out of Green Power, and it talks about tools to obviously promote or get renewable energy projects through and some of the pitfalls and things to be aware of.
Good reading.
Okay. Please.
Question for Matt. I'm curious to know what your experience or DTE's experience is with these local zoning ordinances and the local regulatory process.
It's a good question. Well, they go from very open-armed, you know, not without requiring any requirements, although we do know another developer who chose an area that had decent wind. There was no local ordinance. They just set up shop. They followed standard wind development practice. But there are a number of ordinances in Huron County, which is where we're most familiar, that have requirements and setback needs and things like that, but they are generally fairly open to wind. In other words, they allow the practical siting of an economically viable wind farm. I mentioned another draft wind ordinance that's come out that's very restrictive, and we've been working fairly hard in that community. Simply because, frankly, they do raise some issues that we're looking hard at. And the one thing you have to acknowledge is that when people challenge you, it causes you to dig deeper. And so that's one of the things, that's why we've continued to work with these folks. It's not the vast majority of the wind development potential in this location, but it is an area where there's a good opportunity to site wind. So I know on the west side, Eric Nordman from Grand Valley is doing some preliminary work looking at ordinances on the west side. We don't know the ordinances on the west side as well. I know there's at least one county or township that's got a pretty restrictive ordinance, but we also know that there are some ordinances on the west side that are fairly welcoming to wind. So.
Brian?
Just a question kind of along the kind of same lines to kind of go beyond tactics and to thinking about general policy. In some sense, Cape Wind is an easy target or an easy case. Big, mean, rich guy opposing something that will benefit society. So it's all about tactics.
Proposed by another rich guy,
Yes,
I should emphasize.
Very altruistic, I'm sure. What about situations where this siting would affect, low-income folks disproportionately, disadvantaged folks? What about situations where everyone in the community really does oppose it for potentially legitimate reasons? Under what circumstances or what should the process be for deciding, can we trump that? We say, nope, I'm sorry, this may harm you economically, aesthetically, socially, however, but too bad, we're going to do it anyway. So kind of beyond tactics or beyond what law would have to be changed, what is the process or the system or the criteria to kind of make the judgment of those kinds of judgments?
This is a good question for me.
Okay,
Okay, I'd say, well, again, you think of the general public interest of the state. Remember, the towns and the cities are legal children of the state. They're in effect created by the state. And so it's the state obligation to consider the overall public interest, which may include putting up an offensive renewable energy plant in the middle of a low-income neighborhood that no one there wants. It's the way, it's real life. It happens at the national level in some areas. It's the public good. And sometimes, life is unfair, and the poor people in some cases will be hurt more than rich people. You just sort of tolerate it. And remember the hierarchy here, which is that the localities are legal children of the state, and the state officials have the obligation to look at the overall public good as best they can, given human nature and so on.
Bob?
I guess a question to Bob. What was the main factor that prevented the plan from putting them further offshore? Was it water depth, sea state?
Cost. Basically cost. Technology is really not that advanced. Everybody likes to talk about it because it's very alluring, the idea of, you put these things 40 miles offshore, something, out of sight, out of mind. But many of you have seen the movie and read the book, A Perfect Storm. Well, I can tell you the area the foes wanted to put the wind farm, it's too deep, really, to be economic, for one thing. The other thing is huge waves in big storms. I can't imagine what the waves out there were in the 38 hurricane. You get 120 mile an hour wind from the south, and the perfect storm, they had waves out there probably maybe 70 or 80 feet high, and they just couldn't take it. The reason this site was selected is protected, very good wind, and protected and close to the grid. That's why. Sandbar, in the middle of a protected sound, near the most densely populated area in the United States. And the most affluent, too, interesting.
How deep were they?
Well, there's some range. It's a sandbar, it's a sandbar, 10, 20 feet, that range mostly. Some places even shallower.
So let me add a little bit to that. There was a gentleman who came from Germany who spoke, actually in the College of Engineering a couple, maybe months ago, and
We're
I was
all over this issue. Yeah.
yeah, he came and talked about, first of all, think about a wind turbine. It's got a huge mast, and then what's it doing? It's catching the wind. So the force, or the moment, if you're a technical guy or gal, is really pushing down, and so an online turbine is hard enough to do. And then you've got waves slamming on it if you're dealing with deep water, and you've also got all kinds of underwater currents that are wreaking havoc with, the anchoring of your foundation. And there's multiple different approaches or thoughts about how to effectively anchor an offshore turbine. So there's a lot of complexities. And the deeper you go, the more the complexity.
Gordon couldn't afford it. The principle is good, it's just far too expensive. The technology didn't exist when he proposed this thing at the beginning there. Now, I'd say technology for putting windmills, say 25, 30 miles on the continental shelf off Nantucket, it's maybe 10 years ahead. He couldn't afford it. Remember, this thing is costing $1 billion. Probably, it's been delayed so long, probably $1.3 billion, His financial people, by the way, were Lehman Brothers. So that, he knows a lot of people on the street, so hopefully he'll be able to sell bonds, but, challenges.
I have 3 questions. I'll first confess that I did not read the book.
Nobody's perfect. Watch the movie.
Cape turbines were found to improve property values. The property owners will quickly find them to be the most aesthetically pleasing objects in the world. So my intuition would suggest that property value concerns are really the ultimate drivers of opposition. I'm wondering, my first question is, what strategies have you found to be most successful in engaging these specific concerns? My second question is, I'm going to be involved in a project which will deliver a proposal which may include a small-scale wind turbine installation for on-site electricity generation at a small business nearby, a few miles away. And I was struck by what Mr. Whitcomb said about identifying individuals with political and economic power who may help or hinder such a project. And I'm wondering what I might do as a first-year student in recent transplant from out of state to identify these key persons and institutions. And thirdly, briefly, I've seen cell phone towers disguised with varying success in very tall trees. Has this been explored as an option to reduce opposition to vertical axis wind turbines?
For me? For everybody?
I wrote a note, Mr. Wagner.
Okay, good. Better him
You
than
sound
me.
like you look like you're ready to comment too.
I was just going to make one comment, which is it's not legal at all. I don't think it is about property values, actually, even though I mentioned inverse condemnation. The Kennedy, these are people of, it's sort of limitless resources. And I can understand this because I personally, this is more of, from the heart, I have spent every year of my life summering in Emmett County, Michigan. I named my son Emmett. I have a little cabin that's 900 square feet, a little log cabin. It's not worth that much money. But you couldn't pay me $20 million for that cottage. And it's not on the lake. I'm not opposed to, offshore wind farms. But I think there are some people who are so connected to their place, in the world. And it's these people in, Hyannisport. It's people on Harbor Point in Harbor Springs. It's people along the shore in Emmett County. Or fill in the blank. There's lots of places, South Haven, that it is not, I actually don't believe it's a property value issue. I would throw it out as a lawyer. I think it's a bogus issue. I think it's an emotional issue, and I'm sure you feel that way.
I would agree. By the way, they have done studies of property values in Europe where they put wind farms, offshore wind farms, Germany, UK, Ireland, and Denmark, and the property values have gone up. But, no, I think this is basically a psychiatric thing. People are emotional about this. They're worried about their property values because their finances don't really depend very much on the value of these houses. Most of these people have so much money that that's not really an issue.
What I've found, and I think it happened with Cape Wind, and it happened in, some of the areas where we're debating certain communities, is people decide they're against them, and then they build their strategy as to why. And I think it's typically a view shed, and saying that I don't like the way they look is just not as sexy an argument as some other issues. And so what we saw was a progression that was similar to what Bob wrote about, is we saw wildlife come up first. You know, and then we saw concerns, well, it's not really as profitable as people are claiming. Then we started hearing about visual, not just view shed, but, you know, shadow flicker and things like that, and distraction, frankly. Well, what about all the accidents from people seeing the turbine and accidentally driving off the road because they're distracted? You know, it's funny, but there's some truth to it, although it's it's the 100th of a percent. You know, and then.
You probably ought to ground all airplanes too, and any building over a story high. I mean, you know, their life is just chock-a-block with distractions.
The biggest thing currently, and you know, there's a push to understand it better, is noise, and then is there a causal link with health concerns? There's some traction in the thumb with that issue.
Noise, yeah.
The whooshing noise and what some have coined, infrasound is a technical term, but some have coined a syndrome called wind turbine syndrome. And I'm not an expert on noise, although I've learned a lot more lately than I ever thought I would on that. But that's an interesting new twist that some folks have come out with. So, go ahead.
So just a quick observation about the summer play stuff and the rich people and all that. I think it's very emotional for them because these are places where they relax. There's sort of an Epicurean association of these places. This is where they're enjoying the maximum pleasure, both the pleasure of their surroundings and the pleasure of their success, whether by inheritance or the dint of their own hard work. And so I'm serious, being in these places is sort of an expression, it's an affirmation of success, well-being, and happiness. And so anyone who would erode that and their sense of kind of command over this setting is very angering to many of these people. So it's basically a psychological thing. One other thing, the property tax, I think there probably are some places, sort of upper middle class or middle class property where they're probably in a few places worried about property values. Even though, again, from all the surveys I've seen, it hasn't hurt property values anywhere in the world where they put these things up. You know, I'm sure it could someplace. It depends.
There's actually a report that was just released today that talks about property values, and the data analysis of that is second to none. I've talked to some of the authors of that, and you know, it's found that there does not seem to be a significant impact on property values. But don't take my word for it. It's
new. And
it's just
we're all
released.
learning. As Matt said, we're all learning about this stuff. They big surveys in Europe where the property values have risen, but again, there could be other reasons. I'd like to see all the data. But in Denmark, the property values have risen. But
It's 160 pages in
those crazy Danes, those mad Danes.
The report was done by Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and released today, so you can go to the website.
Oh,
I
really?
was going to mention that, thank you.
Thank you.
And it did show that there's no statistical significant impact on property values within about 27,000 survey, I think, in 90 different states across the U.S. Of course, there were none.
Not overseas.
Offshore, because we don't have any offshore projects.
This is US only?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I manage a group called the Great Lakes Wind Collaborative based in 2 provinces, and Matt happens to be on one of my project teams. Nice to meet you, Matt.
Me too.
And I wanted to make a note what Sally said about state regulations, and it's not so far off to have states that would impose a statewide legal or regulatory framework that would kind of keep in check the local zoning issue. We have Wisconsin just passed a state law that actually will do that. They passed a law asking their public service commission to establish those rules. So the rules aren't in place yet, but similar rules are in place in Minnesota and Ohio in the Great Lakes states. So it's not so far off. It could be something down the pipe for the state of Michigan, just an observation.
I will say about that, though, there are some local communities that are vehemently against that. They do not want to give up their control, and so it will not be, if the state succeeds with that, it will not be a battle that's easily won.
We'll have to change some home rule charters.
Home rule states, it wasn't
Yeah.
really one in any
Yeah,
of the other states.
fair enough.
But we did do it for the siting of hazardous waste facilities and for deep injection wells. So it's not unprecedented.
Well, the
Yeah.
Fed sort of did it for the Telecommunications Act, the cell phone towers everywhere. I mean, that's maybe a pretty close analogy. And, you know, those giant phony fir trees, and, you know, they put them in New England, they put a lot of them in church steeples and bribe the churches, especially the Protestant ones. The mainstream Protestant churches don't have any money anymore because they don't have any congregations. So that's become a huge source of revenue for, you know, congregational church ministers and people like that.
We have time for 2 final questions.
One, just comment about sort of the property value issue that I think can be thrown into this mix is community-based wind. Some of the states that are more sparsely populated where wind farms are going in have community-based wind, whereas I think a situation we have in Michigan, we don't have a community-based wind system. You have property owners who have easements who have sold their rights for development and neighboring next to people who are not gaining anything because the wind that's generated in Michigan is going through the grid system and not necessarily being a discount on their local bill at the local level. That's one suggestion. The other thing I might add about local authority is that I think, and this was mentioned earlier, exclusionary zoning, and there's a tremendous amount of case law related to exclusionary zoning. You cannot establish a local regulation that's going to not allow for a turbine to be located in the community. If you run into that, that local government will lose quickly in court. Just a couple of times.
They'll run into it, but they'll lose quickly.
Well, and local governments tend to not have the deepest pockets when
Yeah.
it comes to those types of suits.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And, you know, rural cooperatives, you may see a renaissance of them, like from the 30s, to put up some of this stuff.
There are some other offshore wind farms proposed around the country. I was wondering if you have a hunch of where the first offshore wind farm might come up.
Me? Okay. I don't, in the lake in Central Park, I don't know. The real offshore wind farm, I still think Cape Wind's going to win. I think the Interior Secretary Salazar will probably approve in the next few weeks. Then the lawsuits will begin. This is America, so we'll have a lot of lawsuits. But, you know, I think Gordon spent so much money in this damn thing. I just think it's sort of, you know, it's so iconic. I think that'll probably be the first one. Then they'll probably put a couple off Delaware, or a couple of wind farms off Delaware. Not him, but another group. I think that's going to happen. They have huge support from local people, including the DuPonts. But of course, many of the DuPonts don't summer there. They summer at, you know, Osterville or, you know, the Adirondacks or, and winter in Palm Beach. But oh well. So I would guess that would be the sequence, probably Cape Wind, which I give about an 80% chance of going up. You know, next year at this time, the beginning of it. Yeah, they support it. They're being careful because they're still afraid of the Kennedys, but yeah, they're being careful. Yeah, yeah, the administration's position is basically in favor of it, so far as I can tell. And the Interior Secretary again is supposed to come out in favor of it soon. And then again, this, I don't know how many turbines there are, perhaps 100 turbines off Delaware, you know, off Rehoboth Beach, that area, and so. Who knows? There's some other places further south, the West Coast. West Coast isn't as good because they don't have a long, you know, wide continental shelf there. The best place is really the Northeast. You know, a lot of wind, big continental shelf, you know, from Cape Cod down to the Cape Hatteras. That's the best place. Southwest wind, shallow. So.
If I might, a note and just a couple of announcements before we close. We've primarily been talking about state, local, regional jurisdiction. And Bob, your point about the possibility that the Secretary of Interior might move this along in the coming days or weeks underscores the fact that before the Congress currently is a truly massive energy, climate-related bill that has passed the House of Representatives, is now being stapled together between various committees of the United States Senate, probably coming up for consideration in spring of 2010. And while much of the focus there has been on emissions trading, the cap and trade mechanism, there are also provisions to do many of the same things that are in place at the state level. And the same issues of jurisdiction, preemption, all the kinds of considerations are very much in play. And I'm also mindful that when that House bill was passed, which tip the scales at 1,482 pages. About 300 pages were added in the night before the final vote, many with substantial relevance for the sorts of things that we're talking about. So my sense is we could keep bringing this panel back to talk about the different nuances, because indeed there's lots of learning and different dimensions of this that does need to go forward. Just a few announcements. Tomorrow at noon, any students from the university are welcome to attend a reception from noon to 1, I believe, in room 1240 of the Dana Building. It's an open reception, and Bob will be there before he takes leave.
Before I'm arrested.
Well, it depends. The timing is always uncertain on those matters. So there is that, and obviously we've had a very, very engaging conversation here, one that I think could certainly continue on. And so perhaps we can just head out into the hallway, the great hall out here, and there will be refreshments. You can meet our panelists and perhaps continue the conversation there. Before we adjourn for the day, though, please join me in closing and thanking our participants.